Let me just say a few words of introduction here. My name is Joe Whitwell. I'm Executive Director of Covenant Counseling out in Snellville, Georgia. And we do have a CPE center attached to our group. A couple of just logistical kinds of things. Bathrooms are just outside the door, so feel free if you need to get up and go. There it is, right outside. We will take about a 5 to 10 minute break right around 11. And there's still plenty of food out there. Please go get it, because I don't want to have to eat it all weekend. So help yourself. One other thing, if you've got cell phones, please turn them off now, so we don't have that interruption during our time together. One of the joys of modern technology. So if you'll do that, that would be great. As you can see, we are taping this event. Dare I call it a historic event with all of these folks here who have gathered to talk with us about some of the history of CPE. Our agenda is that for the first hour, we basically will be hearing from the panelists about their experiences, about their work in their particular centers back in the early days, which we were talking about the 50s, 60s, maybe early 70s. And then after the break, we will have time for audience participation, for you to ask questions of the panel members or to share, if you will, some of your story of the past. What I would ask is, once we do have the audience participation, anybody who wants to share or ask a question, please come here to this podium so that we have the microphone right here and can hear your question and that sort of thing. So if you will do that, we'll appreciate that very much. One thing, I had advertised that one of our panelists would be Jerry Jenkins. Unfortunately, Jerry had a commitment with the Presbytery today and could not make it. So I'm sorry that he couldn't be here, but hopefully others on the panel will be able to fill in for some of what he might have said to us. Also would like to recognize 2 or 3 people. One is Helen Patton. Helen Patton is here. She was at one point the administrator for the National Office of ACPE, and later became the acting director in the interim between a couple of executive directors. So thank you for being here, Helen. Another person who's here with us is Eleanor Verdery, back here on the back row, wife of Gus Verdery. Gus was a longtime regional director of ACPE, and Eleanor was the right-hand person for Gus in keeping the financial records. Back in the early days, I was the regional treasurer for the region of ACPE, and Eleanor and I had lots of conversations about financial matters back in those days. So glad you could be here with us also. I would have introduced separately one of our panelists, but since we've asked him to be on the panel in Jerry Jenkins' stead, George Dominic, second from your right. George was at the Old Georgian Clinic, if you see that on your chart, over there with John Crow in those early days. And he tells me he is now 89 years old. God bless us all. Let's see if we can get that far along. Franklin Duncan is to your far right here at Care and Counseling of Georgia and the head of their CPE training program. Jasper Keith, who is now and has been for many years our regional director. Dr. John Patton, who was longtime executive director of GAPC, and then at Columbia Seminary as a professor, and Zeke Delosier, who was with me for a number of years doing CPE at Wesley Woods and at GAPC for many years before moving to Athens and starting a private practice. So thank you for being here. We look forward to your stories. One other word of thanks. I don't know whether she's in here or not. My administrative assistant, Sheila Kitchens, helped us pull together a lot of the logistical kinds of things and got our food and drinks prepared for us today. So I want to thank Sheila for that. And a couple of my CPE students, Jamie and Callie, helped with the registration. So thanks to everybody. One other disclaimer, on your chart, I've talked some with Jep and some of the other panel members and other people that I've known through the years to try to put this chart together. I do not claim total accuracy. If I've left anybody out, I hope you won't be too offended, and you will let me know. We may use this as a draft to develop a bigger or larger chart to help us in the historical committee of ACPE to remember some of the people and personalities as we go along. So with all of that said, if you want to sort of keep up with some of what we're doing today, you might reference your chart to see who's speaking and where they were. The way we'd like to start with the panel, I've asked Jep Keith to paint sort of a broad picture of ACPE, some of the early beginnings. You see on the chart some of the organizations, agencies that went in to form ACPE in 1967. But Jep knows a lot of that history. Others may want to chime in on the history. And after Jep gives us sort of an overview, then what I want to do is let each panelist take 5 to 10 minutes to talk about their center, where they were back in those early days, and to share any stories about their center and what happened in those centers. So that's sort of the format. And so at this point, without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Jasper.
Thanks, Joe. If you look at the history chart that you have before you, I'll say a few words about that quickly and try to move on quickly with more conversational information from the panelists. But you'll note that there were 4 organizations in existence. Let me begin with the Council of Clinical Training first. It was formed in the early 30s. Andon Boysen did the first unit of CPE in 1925. And the council was in the New England area and later was officed in New York. And Fred Keither was one of the directors, and his name is important because he was involved with Obert Kempson's certification process. And Stuart Hiltner was one of the executive directors, and we all know that Hiltner made a great contribution through theological education, and a number of doctoral students from his program staffed many of the schools of theology for a long time, including John Patton. The next group, the Institute of Pastoral Care, was also begun in the early 30s. Russell Dick's Art Ministering to the Sick, one of the first books that was published in the field. And Roland Fairbanks, who was an Episcopalian, and they mostly operated in general hospitals in the Northeast, Boston, General Boston, Mass. Being the major one. Those 2 organizations had the corner on the market for a long time, and Basically, the institute was in general hospital settings trying to teach pastoral care skills, and the clinical training was in mental hospital settings, prisons, trying to understand the living human document. One understood clinical being at the bedside, and the other understood clinical is trying to understand how folks function. The Lutheran Council of Social Services was mainly in the Midwest, and was in the business in the late 50s certifying supervisors, and they did a lot of social service agencies. Henry Kessler, who was the fourth president of ACPE, came out of that body, and another name you might read about is Ed Mankey. The other group, the Southern Baptist Association for Clinical Pastoral Education, wait a minute, that's wrong. The title of that is Southern Baptist Association of Clinical Pastoral Educators. They fully understood themselves as being educators, and were very connected to Southern Baptist seminaries, and like to think of themselves as being educators of clergy, like theological educators of clergy, except they call themselves pastoral educators of clergy.
We obsessed about that for a whole day.
A whole day. A whole day. That's right.
Down in New Orleans. Never forget it.
Yep. And it's been in my mind all these years because we obsessed about it. And one of the only articles that ever got published that I wrote had to deal with the very issue of whether or not is of clinical pastoral for clinical pastoral education or of educators. And I always wanted the association to be educators, a guild of professional educators. And so did some of the rest of us. You might remember the names of Wayne Oates and Sim Southard from Southern Seminary, Al Myberg, Ed Thornton, Dick Young down at Southeastern, and Al Myberg was the third president of ACPE. That body came into being in the late 50s. Mm-hmm. So, in 1967, each of those bodies, in one way or another, voted themselves out of business. And the House of Delegates, first House of Delegates of ACPE, Incorporated, ACPE, met in October 24, 1967, and adopted its governance and instructed its executive committee to incorporate. And on November 17, 1967, the ACPE was incorporated in the state of Massachusetts, and on 1 January 1968, ACPE was in business, and all of the other bodies were out of business. Any comments or questions you guys want?
I wonder, Jap, when theological seminaries were related to the various organizations. You mentioned the tie with Wayne Oates and the Baptist, say the Council and the Institute. I can't remember how involved theological seminaries were in the early history.
I don't suspect in the early history, except for Andover Newton and the seminaries in the Northeast, maybe some seminaries in Chicago when Boysen went over to Chicago. Carol Wise was over in that area eventually, and I suspect we're talking about mid-50s for most of them.
Paul Johnson at Boston University.
Yeah. Okay. And but from the very beginning, the leaders in the Southern Baptist Association were theological educators. Oates and Sim and Ed, all of them were in there. Okay?
The Council of Clinical Training was the earliest one, and the seminaries were a certain number of seminaries, I think, were very much involved. In fact, they were very much questioning us at every point of what we were teaching students, because I think the Council for Clinical Training was much more psychoanalytically oriented. In fact, I think most of the early supervisors were in psychoanalysis themselves, except me. And I tried, and the analyst would tell me I wasn't ready. And that was probably a good thing.
Helped you live till 89.
So the seminaries, particularly Columbia and Union and in Richmond and even in New York, Hartford, I came from Hartford, they were questioning us at every moment what we were teaching, and we weren't teaching enough pastoral care. We weren't Bible-oriented. We weren't particularly theologically oriented. We questioned every theological from Bruner down. And we gave professors in seminaries an awful hard job. And I think out of our ignorance, however. But they were very much involved and very critical of us to begin with. And I think the New England group was much more theologically oriented and accepted by the seminaries.
Yeah, I agree. Could I take one more minute and put this in focus in the Southeast region? Because there's some people who've gone on to glory who need to be represented here today. Obert Kempson offered the first program of CPE in Columbia, South Carolina in the summer of 1946. He received some training from Ernie Bruder in 47 and was certified. And Tom McDill, the professor at Columbia Seminary, encouraged a group of students from Columbia Seminary to go to Columbia, South Carolina for their first unit of CPE in 1948. Gus Verdery took some courses with Wayne Oates in the late 40s, and after serving a year as an associate pastor here in Atlanta and being a director of religious studies down at Mercer, he went to the Georgia Baptist Hospital in 1952, and two of his associates, Zeke Delosia and Charles McKnight, he called preceptors. That represents his theological understanding. He was the professor, and his associate supervisors were his preceptors. You remember that, Zeke?
I do.
Absolutely. Well, Gus and Tom McDill were pretty close, and a lot of folks from Columbia went also down to Georgia Baptist. And Gus did also some training with Charles Hall, who was the first executive director of ACPE at the Georgia Clinic in 1957, and did a unit under Charles Gherkin at Grady in 1958. And the long and short of that is that meant that Gus Verdery was known and trusted by both council supervisors and Baptist supervisors, and that put him in a position to really make a major leadership in the Committee of 12 that eventually brought into the being the standards for ACPE and the organization itself. In 1957, Charles Gherkin was employed by the Atlanta Christian Council to direct a chaplaincy program at Grady. Chuck had studied with Carol Wise. He'd been supervised by Fred Keitha. He was certified by the Council of Clinical Training in 1951. And by 1962, Chuck had gathered around him enough support from churches and seminaries in Atlanta that the Georgia Association for Pastoral Care was founded, with Chuck being its first executive director. And he remained in that position until he took a professorship at Candler School of Theology in 1970. Doug Turley, a cadet from the Citadel, served the military after the Korean War and then went to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and got his certification process with Clarence Barton in Louisville, offered a unit of CPE in Longview Mental Hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio in the summer of 1960, and I was one of those students. And in the summer of 62, Turley became the director of chaplaincy at Central State Hospital in Milledgeville, And soon to join him on that staff was Henry Close, and Chapel Wilson, and Jim Travis, and Tom Summers, and Peyton Cook, and Charlie Alston, and me. And I was in the first intern group there and the first residency there, and was certified in 1965. Turley came to Georgia Mental Health Institute. Jim Travis became the director in Milledgeville, and then the Georgia CPE, the Atlanta CPE, it was called the Georgia CPE Cluster, was formed. And we might talk a little bit more about that. And then in 67, the ACPE was formed, and the rest we're going to talk about, well, not all of we're going to talk about. A lot of we're going to talk about is what went on then in ACPE, not these founding organizations. But I was certified by the Southern Baptist. Zeke was certified by the Southern Baptist. You were certified by the council. You were certified by the council. You were certified by Southern Baptist.
No, ACPE.
ACPE. This is the young chicken in the crowd.
I was turned down by the Southern Baptists in their last meeting.
Okay.
George, were you like one of the earliest certified supervisors?
I was certified in 1946. 46. And I was ordained in 45. And my first job was in 1946. I went to St. Louis City Hospital under the E&R Church, who paid salary to the council churches in St. Louis. So
What that means is he was the first person certified that was a supervisor in the Southeast region. Overt was certified in later, 48.
There obviously is a lot of folklore and mythology that floats around in ACPE. And I don't know whether it's true or not, but if I tell one on Jap Keith, because I've often used this analogy with CPE students, and you can tell me whether it's true or not, Jap. Supposedly Jap was introduced when he first went to Central State. He was taken to the women's pavilion, and they were walking through, and he had been assigned to that unit. And supposedly an older lady walked up to him. She had snuff running out of both sides of her mouth. And Jap introduced himself, said, "I'm going to be your chaplain." And she said, "Well, can I ask you a question?" And he said, "Well, sure." And she said, "Do you love me?" And he said reluctantly, "Well, sure." And then she said, "Well, kiss me." So that's one of the stories out of the early CPE. I think what I'd like to do now is perhaps we can just start with Zeke. And some of you have been at more than one place, so do that as you will, but say a few words about where you were initially and then wherever else you went to, and whatever you want to say about that history.
Joe, I need to address y'all. Good morning. I don't know why you're here. I came here to see who's still alive. And I'm grateful to see we've still got some around. I'm amazed at George Dominic. I'm not a history buff. And when you're in the middle of the history, you really don't know what's going on. So I've learned something, a lot from just your telling about it. Yeah, thank you for that. I came to Georgia Baptist in 1957. I was the second preceptor, which I thought was a little pretentious, but because I didn't feel like one of those. I was pretty green. And did what I called an internship for a year. George Baptist asked me to stay on, Gus asked me to stay on. And so we began doing what you would call CPE today, but it was just ministers in the community who were, quote, hungry, wanted something. They had a felt need, and we would come in and assign them units to work in and get in groups and talk about it. One of the things back then that was important to us is they would always ask us what to read and how to do it, and we would say, go up and visit somebody and come back and we'll talk about it. And it was an experiential type of training that we did. That was before anybody was certified. I had some inkling that Gus was trying to get certified. He was working through Chuck Gherkin, who came in 57 also. But he had a foot in both when when the Baptists got together. And as I understood this from John, Wayne Oates tried to get certified by the council.
That's right.
Yeah.
And of course he'd want to be grandfathered, and they turned him down.
That's right.
So, like Baptists are prone to do, we just build our own church and baptize ourselves. And that's what we did. So we certified ourselves. And I remember lots of meetings during that organizational period. And like I say, we obsessed a whole year. I mean, a whole day. It seemed like a year. What to call ourselves. After 12 years at Georgia Baptist, I went to GAPC. Half-time at Wesley Woods, starting a program there. John had already done some work down at Wesley Woods, but I was the first one on campus that did that. One strange thing, I was a Baptist down at a Methodist institution, and Methodists like to feel connected. They want to know how people are connected, and they didn't know how to connect me. And I didn't know what was going to happen. Wasn't sure they were going to keep me, but apparently they liked me, and they found some way to connect me. I'm not sure what it was, but they found some way to get me connected. That was quite an experience down there. I was in what they call the health center, which is a traditional nursing home. My office was there because the other folks associated a chaplain with death. So they didn't want me in their building. And down there it was all women. And at first it felt like I was in a women's restroom because it felt so strange to be among all women, and I didn't know who I could trust, who I couldn't. Every now and then I'd go to my office, pick up the phone and dial time just to get a neutral voice and feel a little better. The other half of my time was with counseling, pastoral counseling. We've always, some call it pastoral counseling, some call it pastoral psychotherapy, and we don't know just exactly what it is. The other thing I remember is that Gus was on the staff of the Georgian Clinic at that time. And I had heard about it and wanted to go out there, so I went out for a staff meeting. Al Agron was an interesting psychiatrist. He would evaluate all these people, and at the end he would say, I don't see any hope for this person, which would stimulate the staff. Like, we'll show you. And that was a very interesting thing to me how he did that. Sid Eisenberg, who was also a psychiatrist, they were like good cop, bad cop. He was always a little more optimistic.
Yep.
Well, after staff was over about 3 o'clock, I think. Dr. Vanell Fox, who was the clinical director at that time, and who always said, if you work with alcoholics more than half time, you'll go crazy. She came up to me and said, I want you to lead a group at 4 o'clock. And I said, I've never led a group in my life. She said, well, hell, go in there and sit down. You'll learn. And I said, lady, to myself, if you got nerve to ask me, I got nerve to do it. So I did. And that was one of the things that really helped me learn not to have an agenda for people. But let the agenda come out of the group. And that was a wonderful, wonderful experience and amazing. Another experience I had down at Georgia Baptist when I was still an intern was the chief of staff came to me. He was a surgeon and a well-known surgeon, and said, I've got a middle-aged woman up there that I did a hernia operation on. He said, I've done hundreds of these. She's up there dying. Would you go by and see her? Well, you know, I didn't know what to do. But again, I said, if you're going to ask me, I'm going to go. So I went in and introduced myself as Chaplain Delozer, and she pulled the sheet up over her head. I was so shocked that I couldn't say anything, which was the very thing that I should have done. But I didn't know it at that time. In a little while I said, I hope you're feeling better soon. I'll be back to see you tomorrow. And I thought, what in the world am I going to tell that surgeon? So sure enough, first thing in the morning, he was down the hall, spotted me. Chaplain Delozer, I don't know what you did, but all that woman's vital sign is perfect. All right, what do you make of that? It's one of those, that's a question that can go in all kinds of directions, but one of the things that helped me understand was that it is our person and our interest in another person that is very energizing and very healing. The rest of the story, when she did, the next day I went by and she did the same thing. Third day I went by and she pulled the corner of the sheet and looked at me with one eye. And then the first thing she said to me was, would you go check on my cat? I said, sure. I came back and said, your cat's fine. The long story short, or the long story better, is that her husband died, and she went to live with her parents. Within 6 months, both of her parents had died, and she went to live with an unmarried sister. And within 3 months, she died, and she came to Atlanta to live with a married sister who had children and really didn't want her. So with all that grief, she was just going to check out. But the cat had followed her all the way through. That experience has fed me until this day. It keeps feeding me. Both of those experiences keep feeding me because you can think about them in so many different ways. I talk slow, Joe. I've used my time.
Yeah.
Okay.
about it. We can come back and maybe other things. If I throw in a sidebar here, speaking of Sid Eisenberg, some of us back in the early pastoral counseling days used to go down and sit with Sid Eisenberg. And we'd always have some new students, and one of the first things that he would manage to say is, "I'm an atheist." And of course all the students said, "Oh, well, how can you be an atheist?" And everybody react. So that was always an interesting interchange with Sid. But the other thing that I always remember about Sid's office, one of his patients had made one of these sculptures out of pieces of metal, nuts and bolts. And it was a picture of a patient, Anne Lazanne, lying on the couch. That's sort of that pensive look. And then the analyst sitting there behind with his hand behind him and a little teddy bear in his hand. So I always remember that image. It keeps us in balance in terms of who we are as persons with other people. John, speak to us.
Okay. Thank you for making it possible for me not to follow directly after Zeke Delozier, which is a task in itself. Thinking about those of you who wonder why in the world you're here hearing about all this history. I came up with, just looking back at the CPE standards, probably the premier one that says that what CPE is about is to understand and utilize the clinical method of learning. Now, what I'm saying to you is I think what Zeke's been talking about has something to do with the clinical method of learning. Some of that is a fascination with the real stuff of life, which is my understanding of clinical. And the other part has to do with relationship, the kind of mystery of human relationship where something can happen that we can't fully understand when folks get connected with each other. One other thing I told Zeke recently, I learned from him, one of the ways he used to talk about CPE is that what we try to help folks learn in CPE is that they are hungry and they're going to be hungry the rest of their lives, which is a way to say people need people, and CPE's clinical method of learning is a way of helping folks connect and realize they need that, and there's no great harm in reaching out and touching another human being and say, hey, I need some help, or I need to be with somebody.
I'm 78 and I'm still hungry.
Well, I am 77, I am too. Okay. Quickly, some history. The first sort of CPE I had was at the University of Chicago Clinics in a PhD program where I was with Granger Westberg, who was in the Lutheran system. Granger was he was a charmer as a chaplain. He worked in the hospital and everybody thought he was wonderful, and he was in many ways, but he in comparison to what I learned later in the council supervision training, it was much more on the surface, learning how to listen to people, following the methods of Carl Rogers. I went from Granger to South Carolina State Hospital with Obert Kempson, and had many of those experiences like Jap in the mental hospital. I remember going to a back ward somewhere and introducing myself as Chaplain Patton, and this woman looked at me and said, well, you're Patton, I'll pat you then. And she proceeded to pat me, and that was the quality of our relationship. I think we got connected up by patting. The other thing, good old mental hospital, this is you talk about these old stories and you grieve over the kind of experience students are not having in the hospitals these days, of the old game of playing the medical student types, and the chaplains played softball against the patients. And you're standing there at the bat, and the catcher looks up and says, Reverend, you know that pitcher killed 3 men. It tended to loosen you up. And we miss some of this kind of thing. I went from there to work with Chuck Gherkin at Grady, and experienced. I look around Grady folks like Joe and Gabe, who were there with me the time I was there, and Grady, like the state hospital, is one of those impossible situations which it reminds me of a statement I think Rural Howe made, that CPE at its best immerses students so completely that they can't help experiencing the human condition as a predicament rather than a problem to be solved. And that's what Grady does. You don't solve the problems. People have, it's like having that sheet over, or you can just come after one impossible situation after another. Now, I'm not, okay. Grady and then my situation, to get a little into the history, I was appointed by the Methodist system to be chaplain at Emory Hospital before I'd been certified, because I had most of a PhD done, and proceeded with the help of what was then called the Georgia Association for Pastoral Care to be able to rotate students out of Grady to supervise my first students while I was still, in a sense, a supervisor in training. There's variations on this now with various placements that hospitals have in other settings, but this was a fairly early one. And one of the real values was of that system at that time. It pulled together people at Milledgeville, later Georgia Mental Health Institute, Georgia Baptist, Grady, and Emory together, and our students would meet together periodically. We'd interact with each other. We helped each other with the certification process. What enabled that was Charles Gherkin and his development of GAPC, and tying in the seminaries. There were representatives on the board from the medical school, and this was to facilitate dialogue both between the seminaries and supervisors, but particularly to make it possible before these four organizations got together for folks to work with Gus Verdery and get certified, get credit for the unit with the council, or vice versa. And this was part of Gherkin's genius that I think helped in the formation of those four organizations later on. That's the good news. The bad news, which is often there, with somebody, a strong leader like Chuck Gherkin was, he was, in quote, a benevolent dictator. And after a while, when ACPE was formed and it was much less necessary for certification or getting credit process, wasn't necessary for us to be together, and folks like the Baptists, we all got a lot of Baptists in it, would break off. GMHI went its way in Milledgeville and so on, and so the old group, which was really the genius of Gherkin and what contributed to the larger history, no longer existed, except the counseling center of GAPC had developed, and it began to go great guns, and centers were established in churches around, and it became larger than the CPE program. I think that's one of the important things to think about in thinking about the history here. And GAPC went on until the name was changed, and now is with the joining together with Georgia Baptist of Care and Counseling Centers of Georgia. One more quick story, and I'll shut up. These early chaplaincy stories are funny about how chaplaincy is received or not received. When I first went to Emory, I discovered that clergy, the chaplain and clergy in general, were not allowed to visit psychiatric patients. They were forbidden because religion and psychiatry were, at odds. Went on about a year. I decided passively to deal with it, and I got a call from the psych unit which said, Reverend, we got a patient down here who's very upset, and can you come down and tell him that the Bible doesn't mean what it says? And I said, well, I'm not sure, but I'll be glad to come down and try. And you might guess what he was bothered about. He was lusting and he was aggressing in his heart and not sure what he might do with that. And I don't know what I did any more than you know what you did, but apparently it went okay. And then they decided, which was good news and bad news, that I needed to screen all the clergy in Atlanta, including the late Archbishop Hallinan. I got out of it by saying, I think I'm over my head, and you better just let these folks in without getting me out of the middle here. Okay.
In trying to keep with our time and also trying to stay in tune with our taping, which is about 60-minute tapes, I'd like to shift over this way. We might kick you into the next hour, Jap.
No problem.
And let Franklin and George have about 5 minutes each.
Okay, I had not any preparation, so I'm kind of off the top of my head. I came to Atlanta in 1964. I had been in many other places before. I started out in St. Louis City Hospital as the first Protestant chaplain and had to establish everything involved with that. And first article I think I ever wrote for publication was in the Council for Clinical Training Journal, trying to describe what I did to establish that chaplaincy. Well, after about 2 years in a marriage, I went into the prison system, federal prison system. I went to Danbury, Connecticut, correctional institution, and then after about 4 years went to the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. During several of those years I didn't have chaplain students, supervision students, so I had to be re-accredited when I left the prison system and went into mental hospital in North Dakota, Jamestown, North Dakota. And then from Jamestown, North Dakota, I went to Traverse City, Michigan Mental Hospital. And then in 1964, moved to Atlanta to direct a federal grant program for the training of clergymen in alcohol and drug treatment. That was a federal 5-year grant, and that's when I came here to the Georgian Clinic. If you can appreciate, and many of the people on the panel can, working in the traditional mental hospital with the hierarchy, you got a director, you got psychiatrists calling all the shots, and the other people work kind of under them, and they're Indians and so on. You came to the Georgian Clinic, and that would blow your mind. The organization of the clinic was with Dr. Fox as director. There were 4 psychiatrists on the staff, each one in charge of a division of service. For instance, there was one psychiatrist that kind of worked with the people who were doing the inpatient work. There was another psychiatrist doing outpatient. We were establishing clinics out in the state of Georgia. One psychiatrist was kind of organizing and working with the people in training, and I forget what the fourth one was. All of them, we've mentioned Al Agrin and Sid Eisenberg, and there were a couple other psychiatrists. They didn't call the shots. I remember they did have to interview a patient, and they never came out with a diagnosis. They thought that was pretty unnecessary. What they tried to decide was whether the clinic staff could work with the person, and that was the criteria at the presentation. The group work and all alcohol and drug services then, and I think now should be, group work. Someone mentioned about what alcoholics can do to you, if you try to do one-to-one with alcoholic patients, they will kill you. The group has to be up functioning, and the group leaders at the Georgian Clinic were these trained pastoral counselors that you've heard about, Gus Verdery and a whole group of other people. They did the group work. I don't know anybody that ever was fired from the Georgian Clinic. What happened was that you left yourself if you could not get with the program. There were several groups of communication functions. Once a week on Friday, an outside group leader, which was usually Gus or somebody else, would supervise or have a group session with all of the staff, including Dr. Fox and everyone, including the cook and people who did the washing and laundry and everything else. It was a total community thing. And the point was that you had to deal with the issues that you had not resolved with each other. Because if the staff is not together, you cannot treat the patient. That was the principle, and I think it's still true today. So those sessions, which were called A&O, beginning and the end, were held every week. I did that, and well, I'll finish up with that anyway. Then we had students too.
One tagline for the Georgian Clinic, I spent the second half of my first unit, first year of CPE at the Georgian Clinic with George and John Crow, who was actually my supervisor, and later came back for my early SIT training at the Georgian Clinic. One of the fascinating things about the Georgian Clinic was CPE students preached to the residents who were in residence or those who came in on Sunday morning. And after the service, we went up to this group room, and the patients had a chance to critique your sermon. And I remember some of the students, especially those who had a little bit of an oily tongue and kind of smart, and those old alcoholics would say, "You sure do have an oily tongue, preacher." Some of the best feedback that you could get that you generally didn't get in the homiletics class.
It was intimidating.
Franklin.
Well, I'm honored to be here and to be basically where I am as the young person on the panel. Don't have that experience much these days, but the primary thing is I feel like where I am and with basically my experiences in CPE have been built upon the foundation of a lot of them that are here today. I was thinking about with Zeke, I heard stories about Zeke when I was at Southern Seminary from Bill Arnold, who would tell stories about Zeke, and I had a sense of a connection with him and the admiration for him and his insight about the process of learning. And I remember even with John Patton, I read an article, book by William Oglesby, I think it was on New Shapes of Pastoral Theology. I remember reading, I said, this man knows what he's talking about and knows how to write, and I began to follow his career with that. Jap I became familiar with in a sense through Samuel Southard, who was my professor there, and also with Doug Turley. He was talking about Doug, and he was talking about Jap, and talking about Jap being down in Atlanta. So I was beginning to realize this was somebody who was going to be significant in the Atlanta area at the time when I was in my graduate studies. And with George Dominic, I became familiar with him because I was at Central State Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky as a chaplain there, and one of the things that I was responsible for a period of time was to do a group with alcoholics. So I started finding materials that people that he had written, that people had been in training with him about, and contacted, and that was very helpful to me in pulling together how I could do that most effectively. So I feel a lot of connection with all of you here this morning. My history basically is a little bit different, but it's similar in the sense that I came out of Southern Baptist tradition with Wayne Oates. I was in Louisville, Kentucky, where I did all of my training basically at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, both in terms of a master's degree and pastoral care under Swan Hayworth. That took place because I was supposed to do it under Samuel Southard, but he left. So I did it under Swan. and basically did my training at Central State Hospital and the University of Louisville School of Medicine, downtown Louisville, for most of my units, and then did my supervisory training down at the University of Louisville under John Boyle. As indicated, I went before the Southern Baptist educators, I guess that was 1967, for associate at that time. It was turned down because there was 14 people in there representing all these different groups, and I didn't know how to handle it. I got mad about the fact that there was so much political stuff going on, and I didn't think anybody was paying attention to me. And so a year later, I went before the ACPE group, and there was 13 of them, and I passed unanimously. So I learned my lesson, how to take better care of myself. In terms of my training, I did my doctoral work under Wayne Oates there, and I had a unique experience there with University of Louisville School of Medicine. He put me in a unique position as a resident with the Department of Psychiatry, and I was in equal status with all the psychiatric residents for a year and a half.
That wasn't good.
And so in that period of time, I learned a lot. Also, I was in charge of teaching psychiatric aids. They had a psychiatric aid program through Southern Seminary there on that Norton Psychiatric Unit for over 30 years, really. And I was in charge of the training for that period of time as well. I remember it didn't put me in good stead with the psychiatric residents when I was in a seminar with the director of psychiatry and the residents, and we were talking about group therapy theory and that kind of thing, and one of the psychiatric residents said, well, the only kind of group therapy I believe in is 6 psychiatrists and 1 patient. And I looked at him and I said, well, as frightened as you are of patients, I understand you're saying that. CPE kind of encounter, kind of IPR wasn't acceptable sometimes in that kind of At Central State, I served as a chaplain at the University of Louisville School of Medicine area down there for a couple of years at the rehabilitation unit, and then I went to Central State Hospital as chaplain during the latter phase of my doctoral work, and when I finished and I stayed for a couple of years, they put me into administration. I was over all psychiatric programs there. They changed it to River Regional Hospital for almost 2 years, and then I came to Athens and set up a CPE program in Athens. Between the hospital there, Athens General Hospital, and the Northeast Georgia Mental Health Center. I'm covering a lot of territory here. And then, basically, whenever I finished that, I'll just kind of maybe I'll get more details about it later. The one thing I'd say about Central State Hospital is I do miss that experience. That was the formative things, both in my training that was there, because it was what really got me into the field, as well as in terms of where I saw the students, because Clarence Barton and I were running a good 30 students a year through there in terms of training. There was always a wonderful experience that I had. The students learned a lot. The patients were so wonderful with them. I remember a group of students always, there was this one patient who would just say anything that popped in his mind, and the students walked up to this student. He said, well, you're a good-looking man. And the student didn't know what to say, and he just said, well, you're not the first one to say that to me. And then immediately the patient said, I'm not the first one to tell you a damn lie either. But those kinds of experiences are formative for all of my students as well as for me. And then when I was in Athens, we ran a program that I was really proud of where we provided CPE for local pastors. I remember my first unit that I did there was 10 pastors that came in for training with an extended unit, and we continue to do that kind of thing in training as well as residents that we have there, both in mental health as well as in within the hospital itself. And then I went out of CPE for a while, went into private practice with my own psychotherapy center, did that for a few years, and then was asked to join the Atlanta Psychiatric Clinic in Atlanta, which I did in 1987. In 87, also during that period of time when I was in Athens, I served on I was chairperson of the National Standards Committee, served on that for several years, both when I was in Louisville and then continued that when I was in Athens. And then I also served as chairperson of certification for the region. They asked me to do that after I came down here, and I did that for 3 or 4 years. But then when I came to Atlanta, at the clinic, I was out of CPE for about 2 years, 2.5 years, I guess. And then I was asked by Gene Locke and Don Cadness to come down and start supervising a couple of residents, contracting for me to do that. And then I was asked by Lee Conver to come down and start supervising pastor counseling students and pastor counseling. So I was doing work on both sides for a while. That changed, things changed as financially, whatever, and then Don and Gene had me starting supervising CPE residents. Gene left and went to up to Northside Hospital. Lee left and went to Southern Baptist Seminary to teach, and so there was a lot of changes that have gone on. Oh my Lord, I'm getting tired just thinking about it. We've had massive changes to where it was a sense to where the hospital was sold, Don Cadness retired, to put a long story short, everybody was gone, even Jerry Jenkins retired, and I was standing there and I was the only one left. And so they were even talking about whether CPE was even vital part of the Georgia Baptist healthcare system any longer. And so what we were able to do was begin to do contractual kind of work with the hospital, begin to establish that. We moved in 2003, after we established the Verdery Center in 2000, we moved to where we merged the Verdery Center with GAPC in 2003. And so we built on the tradition of Gherkin and the tradition of Verdery that we pulled together with the Caring Counseling Center of Georgia. And we established a CPE program that's a freestanding CPE program, which I can talk more about, which is the new phenomenon with CPE these days in terms of its survival. And so we have 14 different placement sites. We have all kinds of contracts. We're now a postmodern kind of CPE center that's dealing with a multiplicity of and complexities of our society. Now that's...
Thank you all. We'll come back. There may be some things that have been stirred that you can think about and want to speak about, and we'll also hear from Jeff to begin with. Might be worth saying, most of you in organizations know that one of the things that consultants and other people talk about in terms of organizations is it's awful important to go back and reminisce about the history of your organization. That's part of what keeps that organization moving forward, so that you're always going back and remembering your history. So I'm appreciative of all of these folks here today who have brought some of that history to us in a very personal way. We want to start out this hour hearing from Jep, since we didn't get to hear from him about his particular journey. And after that, we'll open things up for different people to come and ask questions or make comments or tell your story. Nobody please spend more than 3 or 4 minutes. Otherwise, I remember the story of one of the great evangelists who had the habit of asking any minister in his congregation to pray during the time of the pastoral prayer. And one Sunday, one of the good brethren started praying in 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And so he leaned over to his music director and said, "Get ready for the next hymn." And so he stood up and said, "Now, while Brother Jones continues to pray, I would like the congregation to turn to page number 354. So, if somebody gets to praying a little too long, I might ask you to turn to your hymn number 354. Jasper.
Joe mixed up the story that a little bit like that. She did have snuff running out of both sides of the mouth, and she did ask me. But what she asked me was, "Does God love me?" And I reached into my shirt pocket for my Soul Winners New Testament, and a little old woman said, "Preacher, don't pull the book on me. Maybe God loves me, maybe God don't. What I really want to know is, do you love me?" And like Zeke, that story has informed me and haunted me and instructed me since the day the woman said, "Do you love me?" Because that's the question. Any would-be representative of the God of sovereign love, that's the question. I'll stop preaching, tell you a little bit more. Brian Childs wrote a 25-year history of ACPE, and he quoted me in it, and I want to read my quote. I was supervised by Henry Close, who was a council person, and Doug Turley, who was a Southern Baptist person. And both of them in their own way were crazy. Henry sometimes more so than Doug. But I was asked to distinguish the difference between my experience as being supervised by a council person and my experience being supervised by a Southern Baptist person. And this is what I said to Brian Childs a long time ago. Doug, the Southern Baptist, saw me as basically a healthy person who had plenty to learn. And his work with me was going to be as an educator, and I was his pupil. Remember, at the time of the incorporation of the ACPE and the Southern Baptists had an organization. Well, Henry, on the other hand, approached me as a sick soul who needed help, but I didn't know it. And he was going to convince me both how sick I was and how much I needed to get healed before I ever was going to be able to be an educator of anybody. Well, both of them were right, and both of them were wrong. Somewhere in between, Padre, he said, I'm a sinner. Johnny Bull, Padre, he say I'm a saint. Johnny Bull, he say I'm a sinner. I'm neither of them. I ain't. I'm a mixture, and a man from the day of his birth. Well, part of them come from heaven and part of them come from earth, and they were both right and they were both wrong. But the emphasis was on my person and how I was using my person and my history and how that person was going to demonstrate, express, incarnate love, magnanimous goodwill. Well, we've all done a little bit of it, and we all hadn't done nearly enough. But that's what it was all about back there and then. I got involved as the organizational person. Oh, by the way, I wrote my philosophy of education for some of you younger folks, using the Martin Buber's I-thou relations, stuff, and the priesthood of all believers. And I almost got turned down by my committee because they said I had authority issues and I wasn't owning up to them. Or if I didn't know it, I was going to have authority issues with students, because after all of the generations have to kill off the fathers and the mothers before they can become. That's the thought that was going on in some of their heads. And so I decided at a certain point I'd see if I could kill them off. And it happened around the issue of accreditation. The Georgia CPE cluster was in full swing, and everybody was cooperating in it, and Gherkin was a benevolent dictator. And I went out to the Georgia Regional Hospital in Atlanta to open up the first CPE program in a regional hospital, and I decided that I'd get that program accredited directly by ACPE and not go through the cluster. And so I was experienced as being a rebel and all of that stuff, and part of it I was. But another part of it was I was very much involved in the writing of standards and accreditation processes and certification processes in those days. I think I am the only person in the history of ACPE to ever been chair of all three of those national commission councils. So there's a sense in which I wasn't being a rebel like Franklin. I was anticipating what was happening the next 20 years. And a year after that, the cluster was out of business. And all of the centers had to get themselves accredited. All of you know I've given 25 years of my life to being the organizational person as a regional director, and I thoroughly enjoy it. And that's enough.
So, I want to, since he mentioned how he helped the organization. Come up here and, no, will you come up here and ask your question? Oh, come and ask your question. All right. This ties in with something I was talking and asking George about, because he was on these committees chairing the certification and accreditation committees prior to the merger. Thank you. 67, and about 12 years there. So I thought maybe George could say something about that.
What do you want me to talk about?
Just the work you had to do to get these organizations come together in the 67.
I think there's somebody probably here more than... I really wasn't involved with a lot of the discussions of bringing these four groups, particularly the Council for Clinical Training and the New England group. I was chairman of the accreditation committee for many years prior to coming to Atlanta and then after Atlanta. But for the merger of the organizations, there's somebody who knows more about it than I do.
It wouldn't have, I think the old Georgia Association, where there was a cooperative endeavor and you could be supervised by either council or Southern Baptist, you could choose which one of those ways you would go to be certified. What was demonstrated in Georgia, in that old Georgia Association, was the model for how we ended up writing standards and creating for the new organization. It wasn't a merger. All those organizations voted themselves out of existence, and a new one was established. So the ACPE was not a merger, it's just it was a new incorporated entity. Now, the Committee of 12 was the body that put that organization together where standards were concerned. And once they could agree on standards, then we began to work out the other organizational stuff. It took us a long time to work out the financial stuff. And we're just now coming to the understanding that every dime in any region belongs to the ACPE. But it took us forever.
And that's one of the differences from the beginning. I remember I was on an early standards committee, but one of the things that happened, there was not a universal agreement on how money was to be handled or how really a variety of things would be handled, and there would be differences from the various regions within the organization. And it was agreed we need to be together in spite of the fact that this group is still doing it this way and this group or this region is still doing it another way.
The standards was the first document. Obert Kempson and Gus Verdery from our region made major contributions to the Committee of 12. And it was around the writing of standards.
Other questions? If you have questions or you want to share a story from your history, come up here so we can be sure to get that taped properly. Dolly?
Well, in 59 and 60, I did my first CPE at Georgia Baptist Hospital. And it was during that time that Gus Verdery and Chuck Durkin were having their groups meet together at the same time. I mean, there was some mutual searching taking place, I think, on both of those parts. Gus from Southern Baptist perspective, I guess, and Chuck from the Council of Clinical Training. I remember that happening. I remember that when I moved to New York later, and decided 7 years later that I wanted more CPE, I met with the council committee, and they turned down my request because they weren't sure about the supervision I got with Southern Baptist. So they wanted me to take some. They wanted me to take some supervision from one of their supervisors, and I didn't do that immediately, but later I did do that. One of the things I remember during that time, and I'd like John, if you will, to say something about it. You came to Atlanta during that period of time. I don't know if it was 59 or 60. And received a very warm welcome at Grady Hospital for the vision for the project. I don't know all about that. I was a CPE student. I remember your coming, but I don't remember the reasons why you came to Atlanta.
I'm not sure we're going to connect on that exactly, Tolly. Okay. I came back to Atlanta from Chicago, served a church for a year. The hospital chaplain at Emory retired, and I was appointed there and needed to get further training and connected with Grady. So I was doing supervisory training with Gherkin at Grady. I'm not quite sure. You experienced something I'm not clear about. Later on, I was chaplain at Grady beginning in 70, I guess, when Chuck went to Emory.
The date don't matter.
Yeah. Okay. Joe, I was intrigued with Franklin's comment and asked him something at the break about this. He used the phrase postmodern CPE, which is what I think most of you are experiencing at this point, which is different from the old institutional trap that we used to be able to apply at Grady or Central State or other places, where folks would be inside the walls and they couldn't get out. And they had to deal with each other daily. Most, I think, of you are in placements here, there, and lots of other places. Franklin was talking about the good news and the bad news of this change, and I wish he would say some more about this.
Yeah, the primary thing is the sense of looking at, of course, one of the major changes that's taking place, as all of us know, in terms of health care, in terms of the financial kinds of constraints, the kind of things even coming down the pike in the next few years with the Medicare and Medicaid cutbacks that are going to really impact us even more. Because I'm already, in terms of talking with some people in chaplaincy or whatever, they'll be talking to me one day, then the next day they'll say, oh, I just got word today I have to cut 6 people out of my staff, and I didn't know that. So this is kind of thing that we're kind of dealing with in this day and age. But apart from that, the main thing was the sense of looking at that there are all these different kinds of settings that we begin to look at as we begin to move as a freestanding center, that we realized we were going to need to do that to survive as a center, since Georgia Baptist healthcare system had divested itself of all kinds of medical care services, and so we were basically having to find a new home or disappear. And then GAPC was looking for a new way of doing business as well, and so there was a way, as I said, we merged together. And doing that, and that put us in the place to where the CPE, rather than becoming sort of an albatross around everybody's neck, felt like we needed to find a way by which we could survive. So in that, I began to look at the thing in terms of the postmodern kind of perspective. We've got a multiplicity of settings, of cultures in our society, of different kinds of services in our society that are all there, that CPE, I felt like, needed to begin to look at and address if we were going to survive, and if we could become innovative and provide education for modern ministry in a postmodern kind of way in terms of what's happening. That it wasn't going to be just one particular setting, as John is talking about, that's tied in with 4 walls, but can we be faithful to the standards of CPE and to the accreditation kind of expectations, and do it in an innovative way to where we can find where the supervision, the administrative connections maintain that. That's always going to be a struggle, but it's something that we've been working at trying to do at CCCG. So we've worked in settings in terms of looking at, you have, say, a group doing training in a hospice, people may be doing training in a community, such as public housing, private housing, like at Eastlake, or if we have in terms of where someone may be doing training in a church, or someone who's doing training as well as in a medical center, or they could be like we have a training in the Salvation Army. We have all these multiplicity of different kinds of settings, and we begin to look at how can we make it faithful to CPE standards and CPE expectations and clinical method of learning. What I found, and we're still learning this, is that with these new kinds of paradigms, that people learn and still can learn without everybody being in the same location all the time. And let me give you an example. I was telling John about it. One of our programs is with the Lilly Grant Foundation with the McAfee School of Theology, which is a program of CPE over a 2-year period of time. They only get 2 units. These students are considered to be residents and function as associate pastors or pastors in these churches for a 2-year period of time. It's subsidized by the churches as well as by the grant. These students are graduates of the McAfee. They come into this is their first placement, and they remain there for 2 years and come in for CPE once a month. I meet with them all day long on a Monday, from 8 o'clock in the morning to almost 6 o'clock in the evening, in terms of individual, group work, didactics, reflection verbatims, theological reflection, IPR, all of that. We do all of that within that period of time. Over the 2-year period of time and working with it, it's a slower process, as I told John, for example, but I have found that it worked. That the students became more and more involved with one another. At first they all knew one another, so they were taking care of one another. And eventually they got to where they were confronting one another and confronting me and dealing with issues. But the main thing that I found was the intimacy that developed over that period of time was in some ways more akin maybe somewhat to the therapeutic process, because there was more of a connection over that 2-year period of time. And I found myself, when the students finished, that first group finished in 2 years, I was missing them. Very much missing them. And very much invested in their being successful in their new placements. And all of them have new placements, and they're doing quite well. And so when we continue to communicate by email with one another about that, and they kind of, what they refer, I'll always have what they'll say, my old supervisor is what they'll put as the message, and then they'll start giving me messages about what they're doing, and there's still this kind of training that's going on. And also how they're trying to find ways to get connected to people where they can continue to get the consultation that they learn to get with the CPE model. We have another group like with the Salvation Army, which is a group of 8 students. Basically, these are 8 officers that are placed in the Southern Territory in all kinds of different areas, from Key West to Dallas to Washington, D.C. and around. We have a supervisor who's contracted to meet with them. They come in, they get 4 units in 2 years. They come in, and for a solid week down here at their continuing ed center, their educational center, they meet with the supervisor for a solid week. For a lot of all these seminars, a lot of all this stuff that we do with CPE. And they do that twice within 1 unit. And what happens is that also he goes and visits each one of them once during each unit at their sites. It's at Key West, flies to all these places and spends a day or 2 with them in terms of verbatim, meeting with their staff, meeting whatever, but basically providing supervision in their particular setting. If you were to take that group and they come in, you would think, well, and also what he does also is he has a conference call with them, all of them together for a verbatim seminar, 3 or 4 times during the unit. The primary thing that happens in that, if you go, and I've gone and I've sat with them because we're into our 3rd group with this, you can sit down with them after about 12 months or 16 months and sit down with them, and I've had that in feedback from them and started and watch them and interact in the kinds of issues that they start addressing to me in the group or whatever, or seminar I'm doing. It's very, very similar to any CPE group. And even though they're a homogeneous group, they have found ways to do the job with that. So I'm saying in the postmodern kind of thing is a sense of looking at these different contexts and tailor-making them that it meets the standards but also meets their particular needs that they have. I think if CPE doesn't address that and we're saying you've got to come only to us, we're going to die in that. We've got to find a way to go where they are and what they're needing. So if I'm dealing with a hospice or if I'm dealing with a Salvation Army or a church or any kind of community, I'm always looking at, well, what are you needing? And then let's see whether or not CPE can address it.
Thank you.
Joe, may I pick back on that just a second to say that I did some research for 2 summers, and in the Southeast region, we don't have, in the Southeast region, predominantly training is being done in healthcare systems for the training of healthcare chaplains. And that is a shift that has been made in the last 15 years. I had a question on, are you taking this in order to get certified by professional certification? Yes, sir. Are you taking it for academic credit? No. Who's requiring you to do it? Maybe occasionally some judicatory of the church, but they're requiring themselves to do it because they're looking for jobs in the healthcare industry, hospice industry, whatnot. We are dependent upon the healthcare industry at this moment in time. If you listened to our story earlier, we were dependent upon a drug addiction treatment center and 1-2 general hospitals and a lot of mental health facilities. No more mental health facilities. No more drug. It's a different ball game, and so how do you offer training anymore, living within the standards in a multiplicity of places, preparing people for a multiplicity of ministries?
We go back a moment in history. I'm sure there are probably how many people here trained at Grady at some point in your history? Quite a few. So I'm sure we could get stories from all of you about that. I tried to get Kempton Haynes to tell this story, but he told me to tell it.
You're a better storyteller.
One of the moments in our history, Kempton and I and about 4 other people started at Grady in the fall of 1966. And Chuck Gherkin had just hired J.D. Shillette, and Cal Kropp was SIT. And about mid-quarter, Chuck Gherkin comes bursting into the seminar room and was very flustered and saying, come help, we've got a man in the chapel naked. And we all came rushing out of the seminar room and down the hall, and there at the entrance of the chapel, standing like this, was a beautiful black man whose physique looked like somebody from the Athens tracks or something, you know. Here he was, and we ran up to him. I think Kempton had his collar on, and the man grabbed Kempton and started shaking him and said, "Get those clothes of iniquitous off." And we were able to corral him back into the chapel. He had come in there and had neatly folded his clothes and placed them on the altar, and then proceeded to throw the hymnals and Bibles all over everywhere. We didn't do such a good job of corralling him, but somebody had called security, and pretty soon they had put him in restraints. He urinated all over the chapel floor, and we went back to the seminar room to process that whole experience. Anybody else want to share a story or a moment from your history in CPE?
I have a question. I don't have enough history.
Come on up, Jay. Jay Peabody is one of our students at Covenant.
Good morning. Dr. Patton, you mentioned earlier that you grieve for the experiences that you all may have had as students, and the panel pretty much seemed to be in agreement with that. And so I was wondering what happened to those experiences and how could they be recaptured for us as students?
I don't know. I don't know. I would think that you have your own stories in the outside placements. The trapping students in the total institution was what we grew up with, and I think was very, very helpful. I'm still intrigued with what Franklin said about CPE supervision, which is now more consultation than supervision, I think. Being like pastoral counseling with when you have counseling with a longer term person that you're working with. I really don't know how to go back. I'm glad to have had those experiences, but I'm not sure where to go to respond to your question.
No, I don't need either. I was thinking that one of the things is certainly it ties in with economics is part of the problem. In some ways, is that in the early days, my early days anyway, in Louisville at Central State Hospital, at Louisville General Hospital, there wasn't such a thing as resident. I always hear about residents down in Georgia, but there were no residents up there. We were all at our own expense. We were all in there doing training. There was a supervisor that was employed by the different facilities, but basically we were on our own to get our own training and get those units in there. And so there was a sense of which, I guess in terms of cost factors at that time, there was a way in which, is the beginning of a movement still, and it was very much still in its infancy. You could be into these things and it didn't seem to be so overwhelming financially to do that. Now it feels like it is in some ways different. It's just like I see all of these mental health facilities in the state of Georgia, and there's no CPE supervisor in them. I keep thinking, well, can somebody just hire a CPE supervisor to be in there, and could we just start placing students in there again where they can get those kinds of experiences? Well, we can't seem to get that to happen for whatever. I mean, it seems to go on by the board. But to say, well, can we get residencies? No, I don't even want to think about residencies. Maybe we could get students who could go in and just get the experience again and begin to feed back into what's really happening if you really want to do that, because those experiences fed me, and like everybody's talked about, I've got those stories that feed me. I'm just going to say one. It was like this woman I was seeing who had been a psychiatric patient there in Central State Hospital almost for about 8 to 10 years. Very disturbed in all kinds of ways, all kinds of stuff, hallucinations, everything. I began to saw her about 2 times a week for a period of time, because she and I developed a relationship, and she got to where she's better, and she got discharged. When she was discharged, after she was gone for about 6 months, I heard word that she had died, which is not altogether uncommon with schizophrenics who get better. And I thought, I didn't know how she died. Did she kill herself? What happened? And so I didn't know, and I was going through my mail just before I was to go in and lead a seminar of CPE students. And I was looking through it, and I noticed there was a letter, like a card, and it had her name on it as a return address. I opened it up, and it said, "May God be of comfort to you." From her. And I just broke into tears. I mean, it still bothers me. And I was there in my tears, and I remember Clarence Barton came in to my office and said something like, it's time for the seminar, and I said, Clarence, I can't. And I told him what happened. And I love Clarence to this day for that. He said, Franklin, you have got to go in there. This is what, I can't think of anything more important to tell your students than this. And so I went in there and shared it with them. And it was a very powerful moment for me as a supervisor, as a chaplain, as a human being in that. All the different levels that I felt. I found out later that she died of double pneumonia. But those are the kinds of experiences that form us and direct us in all kinds of ways. And that's the kind of thing I think is missing in some ways that these people have. It's always said, it's by the stripes of the mentally ill that society is healed. And I think that's what George is talking about we're missing right now. I wish we could get back there.
I can tell you one story that's positive. I can tell you one story that's positive. Well, not that this isn't positive, but I was in Traverse City Hospital, and I went to Traverse City Hospital as a chaplain because of a psychiatrist that had gone there in the outpatient department, and we worked together back in North Dakota. Anyway, he called me one day, and he wanted me to meet a patient of his, a Jewish lady that had been in severe suicidal condition. And anyway, he had treated her. She had a family and had 4 children and had another baby, had been born, and one too many. And anyway, he said, after he had worked with her, he said, I want you to listen to her. I forget her name at the moment. Anyway, and so I started to see her, and he saw her once a week, but I saw her when she came. Well, I saw her probably 2 years there, and I got ready to move. That's when I moved to Atlanta, and she had improved some. And she said, can I write you? And I said, sure. And so she started to write me. And in those times, her husband was a junk dealer in another city. We had, in the 2 years that I worked with her, linked her up with her rabbi, and she began to feel a lot better. Her husband began to pay more attention to her, more than he did the junk which she felt was going on before. And so I kept in touch with her. She moved to Florida. One of her children moved to Israel. Her husband died. I've been listening to her, and she's now in Israel. She's 80 years old. She was 40 at that time. I've been listening to her for 40 years. And she's not depressed. Mm-hmm. She's gone through a lot of physical illness, and we write regularly. Mm-hmm. It's worthwhile.
Yeah.
I think Martha had a question.
Do I need to come up there?
Yes, if you would.
It's not really a question, it's a follow-up comment about what are students missing now. If y'all were the children of Obert, I'm a grandchild because I worked with Zeke and John and Jap and Joe. My statement comes from when I worked with them, I was at Wesley Woods, and we had a group that met with the people from Grady. And what was the people at Wesley Woods were always told we were basically wusses because we didn't get all the trauma calls. And so we weren't doing the hard stuff. And in a sense, I can see why they would say that, because in 2 years of being at Wesley Woods, I can remember being called 3 times after hours. And one time I went and sat there with a woman who was dying whose family didn't even come. So we didn't have the same kind of trauma and rawness. And I think that's one of the things that in the mental health institutions and the addiction centers, there is a rawness, a primal rawness about people's hunger, as Zeke was saying, and their loneliness. But what I learned from being at Wesley Woods is I might not have had the same kind of trauma, but I watched Elizabeth Deason for 16 months gradually lose her mind. And I showed up every day trying to figure out how to love this woman, in part because I needed to be loved and she'd made me her daughter. I think what we have lost is that so much of our life has become sanitized, and we're better at defending ourselves against people like in the mental health institutions who could really bombard our defenses more quickly. And the question really isn't about what we've lost from the fact the settings have changed, but how we're using the settings, and are we willing to say, I'm still hungry and I'm still lonely. And if we can do that, I'm not sure that we've really lost that one.
Very good.
Thank you.
I agree with Martha. I think the placing of where mental health is now is different. I'm a chaplain in a community, and there's a lot of mental health in inner city. And what I'd like for the panelists to talk about is how we might get philanthropist dollars to support community chaplaincy. I had a young man, for a funny story, about 12 years old, and I had a brand new chaplain who was going to be the first resident in the community. He had a bright, shiny black Lincoln. He has 3 children, and he drives his little Lincoln up to the chaplain's corner. I mean, you could put your makeup on in the shine. One of my little urchin children was leaning all on his car. They had their hands all over it. He comes out, don't touch my car. I don't let my children touch my car. So, rightfully so, he moved his car because he didn't know what might happen to it with my urchins. That same little boy was accused of breaking into a car, and I had to stand between him and the police. You're not going to treat him this way. If you want to take him to jail, do that. But you are not going to make a spectacle of him for the Friday night show in this community. You're just not going to do it. Not, and I stand here. So they ended up, the police and all of them come into the chaplain's office. So there's a moment in which I believe where mental illness is, and we can still have the same rich experiences if we find the dollars to do it.
Thank you. Not sure we can answer that question in the time we have left, but wonder if there anybody else, Chapel or Jean?
I have a question, or
okay.
a question and a comment. I'm aware that this is the history of CPE from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I'm also very aware, at least in Atlanta and the Southeast region, that the face of training is changing. For that, I'm grateful. I'm aware there are no women up here because it's the histories of the 50s through the 70s. But from my knowledge, I'd like to know when women entered the training process and comments from you all as to how you've seen the process and training change because both women and people of color have entered the process.
The first woman was Jean Bennett at the Georgia Mental Health Institute. Then, I'm sorry?
I remember.
Yeah.
How the process has changed.
And she went on from there to Scottish Rite. Well, she was at Eggleston for a while, and then from Eggleston out to Scottish Rite.
How does it change CPE?
She was at the Institute 68, maybe, somewhere in there. There were persons of color very early. Glenwood Morgan was CPE supervisor over in Columbia, South Carolina in the early 50s. But you're right. Imogene, I guess, didn't become a supervisor until, I don't know, maybe 68 or 9, somewhere in there.
In terms of color, Gene Robinson came to train with me at Wesley Woods in what year, Gene? 73?
I think before that, though, Dr. Tom Pugh, who was at ITC for a long time, was a hard-nosed little man who insisted that students there have some kind of part-time, at least, CPE, and he fought his way through that faculty to insist on that. And they were there with us at Grady very early. Tom was on the board of GAPC, and we went through some very interesting times during the changes where black students wouldn't visit white patients, and we were having the first groups who didn't want to be together with each other. It was quite a time.
He was a group leader at the Georgian Clinic.
Yeah. We integrated the state hospital in Milledgeville in 1967. No, it was before that, 1964.
The good part of that, I was on the certification committee for years and years. And one of the things that we always looked at was whether this person sitting there before us was operating out of his person. Now that's a developmental issue. Whether the person has developed emotionally enough that they can operate out of their person rather than operate out of procedures and that sort of thing. And it seems like the mixture of the blacks and the women and all of that facilitated people learning who they were. With that kind of conflict, it facilitated that. And it seemed to me that was a lot of what was going on. I would see that in this certification committee. Now, I think that's still going on in CPE. I'm not sure. CPE has become more organized, more institutionalized, and that sort of thing. But I still, from what I can tell, that thread is still there. Is that right?
Yep. Very much so.
Very much so.
Well, I know we're coming close to the end of our time, and I wanted to thank the panelists for all of their contributions.